The abandoned factory had been sitting empty for 12 years. Broken windows. Graffiti covering the walls. Weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. Everyone in the neighborhood hated it. Everyone wanted it gone. The HOA had been trying to get it demolished for years. They called it an eyesore. They said it was destroying property values. They said it was attracting vandals and making the whole area look terrible. So when I bought it, people thought I'd lost my mind. The HOA president showed up at my door the day after closing. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't welcome me to the neighborhood. She handed me a letter demanding that I demolish the building within 90 days. She said it was non-negotiable. She said the community had suffered long enough. She said if I didn't tear it down, they'd fine me into bankruptcy. I looked at that letter. I looked at her standing there with her arms crossed, absolutely certain I would comply. And I said no. I told her I had other plans for the factory. Plans that didn't involve a wrecking ball. Plans that involved renovation and transformation. Plans that would actually make money. She laughed. Actually laughed in my face. She said I was delusional. She said I'd be sorry. She said the HOA would make sure I regretted this decision. Then she walked away, already planning her next move. But she had no idea what I was about to build. She had no idea that condemned factory would become the most profitable property in the entire area. I'd been looking for investment properties for about 6 months. I wanted something with potential. Something undervalued. Something that other investors were overlooking. I'd looked at dozens of properties. Houses that needed minor repairs. Small commercial buildings. Empty lots. But nothing felt right. Nothing had that combination of low price and high potential that I was looking for. Then I came across the factory listing. It was buried deep in the commercial real estate listings. The photos were terrible. Dark. Blurry. Clearly taken years ago. The description was minimal. It just said former manufacturing facility, as is condition, motivated seller. The price was surprisingly low for the size of the property. That caught my attention immediately. I did some research on the property. The factory had been built in the 1960s. It was originally a textile manufacturing facility. It had employed hundreds of people back in its heyday. The building was substantial. Over 50,000 square feet of space. Solid brick construction. High ceilings. Large open floor plans. The kind of industrial bones that you can't replicate with modern construction. But the factory had been abandoned since 2011. The textile company had gone out of business during the recession. The building had sat empty ever since. 12 years of neglect. 12 years of weather damage. 12 years of vandalism and decay. The property had changed hands a few times. Each owner had planned to do something with it. Each owner had given up and sold it at a loss. I drove out to see the property in person. And I understood immediately why previous owners had given up. The building looked terrible. Every window on the ground floor was broken. The exterior was covered in graffiti. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown. Trash was scattered everywhere. It looked like a disaster. It looked like it would cost a fortune just to demolish, let alone renovate. But I didn't just see the decay. I saw the location. The factory sat on a prime piece of land. It was just off a major highway. Easy access. High visibility. The surrounding area had developed significantly since the factory closed. New residential communities had sprung up nearby. An upscale HOA community sat right next to the factory property. Shopping centers had been built within a mile. The location was actually incredible for commercial purposes. I also saw the structure itself. Yes, it was damaged. Yes, it needed extensive work. But the bones were solid. The brick walls were still structurally sound. The roof needed replacement, but the supports were good. The foundation was intact. The electrical and plumbing would need to be completely redone, but the space was there. The potential was there. I walked around the property taking notes. I looked at the size of the space. I thought about what it could become. I thought about the location and the traffic patterns. I thought about the surrounding community and what they might need. I thought about adaptive reuse and how industrial spaces were being transformed all over the country into profitable ventures. The factory was zoned for commercial and light industrial use. That gave me flexibility. I could turn it into almost anything within those categories. The space was large enough for multiple uses. The location was perfect for drawing customers. And the price was low enough that I could afford extensive renovations and still come out profitable. I stood in that overgrown parking lot looking at that damaged building and I saw opportunity. I saw something everyone else had missed. I saw potential that was invisible to people who only looked at the current condition instead of future possibilities. The community around the factory saw something very different. They saw an eyesore that had plagued their neighborhood for over a decade. They saw broken windows and graffiti. They saw property values being dragged down. They saw a constant reminder of economic decline. They'd been complaining about it for years. The HOA had been trying to pressure the city to condemn it. They wanted it demolished and removed. They wanted the land cleared so something new could be built. Nobody wanted that factory renovated. Everyone wanted it gone. The purchase went through on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the HOA president was at my door. I don't know how she found out so quickly. Maybe she had someone watching the property. Maybe she had contacts at the county records office. Maybe news just travels fast in tight-knit communities. But she knew. And she was not happy. She introduced herself briefly and then launched straight into her demands. She said the HOA had been fighting to get that factory demolished for years. She said the community had suffered because of it. She said property values in the neighborhood had been negatively affected. She said residents were tired of looking at it. She said now that someone had finally bought it, the right thing to do was tear it down and start fresh. I asked her what she had in mind for the property after demolition. She said the HOA would prefer something clean and residential. Maybe a small housing development that would fit in with the existing community aesthetic. Something that would complement the neighborhood. Something the HOA could approve and feel good about. I listened to everything she said. I let her finish. And then I told her that I had different plans. I told her I was planning to renovate the factory. I told her I was going to transform it into a commercial space. I told her I believed the building had significant potential and I intended to realize that potential. Her reaction was immediate and dismissive. She said renovation wasn't realistic. She said the building was too far gone. She said the costs would be prohibitive. She said the community wouldn't support a commercial development next to their residential area. She said the HOA would fight any commercial use of the property. She said I was making a mistake. Then she handed me the letter. The formal HOA letter demanding demolition within 90 days. She said the HOA had been working with the city on code violations. She said there were numerous outstanding violations on the property. She said if I didn't address them by demolishing the building, the city could step in and force demolition at my expense. After she left, I sat down and read the letter carefully. It listed several code violations. Broken windows. Unsecured access points. Overgrown vegetation. Accumulated debris. These were real violations that needed to be addressed. But none of them required demolition. They required cleanup and securing. There was a significant difference between addressing code violations and demolishing the entire building. I called a property lawyer that same day. I explained the situation. I asked about the HOA's actual authority. I asked about the code violations and what they actually required. I asked about my rights as a property owner who wanted to renovate rather than demolish. The lawyer was reassuring. He said the HOA couldn't force me to demolish a privately owned building. They could complain. They could pressure the city about code violations. But code violations don't automatically require demolition. They require compliance. And compliance could mean cleanup and renovation, not necessarily tearing the building down. He also explained that my property rights were protected. I had the right to renovate the building as long as I obtained proper permits and met building codes. The HOA's preferences about what they wanted on the property didn't override my ownership rights. They couldn't force me to build what they wanted. They couldn't force me to demolish what I owned. This was exactly what I needed to hear. I had rights. I had options. And I had a vision. The HOA's letter wasn't the end of my plans. It was just the beginning of a battle I was determined to win. The HOA didn't stop at one letter. They followed up with more letters. More formal notices. More threats. They contacted the city's code enforcement department and pushed them to issue official citations. They organized community meetings where residents could air their grievances about the factory. They wrote letters to local council members asking for intervention. They were systematic and relentless in their pressure campaign. The code enforcement citations started arriving. Just like my lawyer had predicted, the violations required compliance, not demolition. The city inspector came out to assess the property. He documented the broken windows, the unsecured access points, the accumulated debris. He gave me a compliance timeline. He said I needed to secure the building, clean up the debris, and address the most immediate safety concerns within 60 days. I hired a crew immediately. We boarded up the broken windows. We installed temporary fencing around the perimeter. We cleared the accumulated trash and debris from the parking lot and surrounding areas. We cut back the overgrown vegetation. We addressed every single violation on the list. Within 30 days, the property was secured and clean. The code enforcement officer came back for a follow-up inspection and confirmed that we'd achieved compliance. The HOA president was furious. She'd expected the code violations to create momentum for demolition. She'd expected the city to side with the community's wishes and force me to tear the building down. But that's not how it worked. I'd addressed the violations properly and legally. There was nothing more the city could require at that point. So the HOA changed tactics. They started showing up at city planning meetings. They argued against any permits I applied for. They submitted formal objections to renovation proposals. They tried to use the planning process to block my progress. Every permit application I filed faced organized opposition from the HOA. But here's what they didn't understand about property rights and zoning. My property was already zoned for commercial and light industrial use. That zoning had existed for decades. The HOA couldn't change that zoning just because they wanted to. Rezoning requires a formal process. It requires significant justification. And it's not something that happens quickly or easily. The existing zoning protected my ability to use the property for commercial purposes. My lawyer guided me through the permit process. He helped me anticipate HOA objections and prepare responses. He helped me understand what the city could and couldn't require. He helped me navigate the bureaucracy efficiently. Every permit I needed, I eventually received. The HOA's objections were noted, but they didn't have legal standing to block legitimate commercial renovation on properly zoned land. The community meetings were interesting to experience. I attended some of them to understand the concerns and occasionally to address them directly. Some residents were genuinely concerned about traffic and noise from a commercial operation next door. Those were legitimate concerns that I took seriously. I adjusted my plans to address traffic flow. I incorporated sound barriers into my renovation design. I was willing to be a good neighbor where it was reasonable. But other residents were simply opposed to anything other than demolition. They didn't want a commercial operation next door regardless of how well designed it was. They wanted the factory gone. They wanted their vision for the neighborhood to prevail over my property rights. Those concerns I couldn't accommodate because accommodating them would have meant abandoning my entire investment. The opposition was frustrating. But it was also clarifying. Every obstacle the HOA threw at me forced me to refine my plans. Every objection they raised forced me to think more carefully about my approach. Every delay they caused gave me more time to plan and prepare. In a strange way, their resistance was making my project stronger. While the HOA was busy organizing opposition, I was busy planning. I wasn't sitting around waiting for them to stop fighting me. I was designing the transformation. I was researching the market. I was figuring out exactly what that factory was going to become and how it was going to make money. The concept I developed was an adaptive reuse project. I was going to transform the factory into a mixed-use commercial space. Part of it would become a marketplace. A large indoor market where local vendors could rent space to sell their products. Artisans. Food vendors. Small businesses that needed affordable retail space but couldn't afford traditional storefronts. The factory's large open floor plan was perfect for this kind of market concept. Another section of the building would become event space. The high ceilings and industrial aesthetic of the factory were actually incredibly valuable for events. Corporate events. Wedding receptions. Private parties. Art shows. Photography studios. The raw industrial look was trendy. It was exactly the kind of space that event planners were paying premium prices for in cities across the country. I also planned a small food hall section. A collection of local restaurants and food vendors operating in a shared space. Food halls had become incredibly popular. They drew consistent foot traffic. They created a destination that people would travel to specifically. The location just off the highway made the factory accessible to people from a wide surrounding area. The financial projections were compelling. The rental income from vendor spaces would create consistent monthly revenue. The event space could generate significant income per booking. The food hall would create daily foot traffic that would benefit all the vendors. The three revenue streams would work together to create a profitable and resilient business model. I hired an architect with experience in adaptive reuse projects. She immediately understood the potential of the space. She got excited about the industrial bones of the building. She saw what I saw. Exposed brick walls that would be beautiful once cleaned up. Original hardwood floors that could be restored. Steel beam ceilings that would create dramatic visual impact. The factory wasn't just a building to renovate. It was a canvas. The renovation budget was substantial. I'd secured financing through a combination of a commercial renovation loan and private investors who believed in the concept. The total budget was enough to do the project properly. Not to cut corners. Not to do a cheap renovation that would look temporary and fail within a few years. But to do a genuine transformation that would last decades and create lasting value. I also researched similar projects across the country. Abandoned factories and warehouses that had been transformed into successful commercial spaces. I visited several of them. I talked to the owners. I learned from their mistakes and their successes. I understood what worked and what didn't. I incorporated those lessons into my planning. The HOA was still fighting. They were still sending letters. They were still showing up at city meetings. They were still telling anyone who would listen that this project was a mistake. But while they were focused on opposition, I was focused on creation. While they were spending energy trying to stop me, I was spending energy building something. That's the thing about opposition. It can either drain you or drive you. You can spend all your energy responding to critics and fighting resistance. Or you can put your head down and build. I chose to build. I chose to let my actions speak louder than their objections. I chose to focus on creating something that would make all their opposition irrelevant. Because when the factory opened and people started coming, no letter from the HOA was going to matter anymore. Construction began on a Monday morning. The crew arrived early. The equipment rolled in. The noise started. And within hours, the HOA president was on the phone with the city complaining about construction disturbance. She said the noise was excessive. She said the construction hours were violating local ordinances. She said residents were being disturbed. But we were operating completely within legal construction hours. We started at 7 in the morning and stopped at 6 in the evening. Exactly within the permitted time frame. The city inspector came out to check. He confirmed we were compliant. The HOA president's complaint went nowhere. That was the pattern throughout the entire construction period. The HOA would file a complaint. The city would investigate. We'd be found compliant. The complaint would be dismissed. Then the HOA would file another complaint about something else. Parking. Dust. Truck deliveries. They found something new to complain about every week. And every week, we were found to be operating within legal requirements. It was exhausting. There's no other word for it. Running a major renovation project is hard enough without someone filing complaints every few days. Every complaint required a response. Every investigation required my time and attention. Every interaction with city officials took energy away from the actual construction work. But I refused to let it stop me. I refused to let their harassment derail the project. I kept a detailed log of every complaint filed against me. I documented every investigation and every finding of compliance. I was building a paper trail that showed a pattern of harassment. My lawyer said this documentation could be valuable if I ever needed to take legal action against the HOA for interference with my property rights. The construction itself had its own challenges separate from the HOA harassment. We discovered that some sections of the roof were more damaged than we'd initially assessed. The repair costs exceeded the budget allocation for roofing. We had to find additional funding quickly. I negotiated with my lenders and secured additional financing to cover the gap. We also discovered that the original electrical system was more extensively damaged than the initial assessment had shown. Complete rewiring was necessary throughout the entire building. This added both cost and time to the project. The timeline extended by about 6 weeks to accommodate these unexpected issues. But alongside the challenges came wonderful discoveries. When workers began cleaning the brick walls, they revealed beautiful original masonry that had been painted over decades ago. The natural brick was stunning. It became one of the most striking visual features of the renovated space. When they restored the hardwood floors in certain sections, they discovered that the wood was old-growth timber. Incredibly durable and beautiful. Worth significantly more than modern hardwood. The industrial steel beams were cleaned and preserved. They became dramatic architectural features that ran the length of the main market hall. The original factory skylights were restored and enlarged. Natural light flooded into the space that had been dark for 12 years. As the renovation progressed, something interesting started happening in the community. People walking or driving past began to notice the transformation. They could see through the newly installed windows. They could see the beautiful brick walls being revealed. They could see the space being transformed from a dark, damaged ruin into something bright and beautiful. Some neighbors started stopping by. They'd stand at the fence and watch. Some of them started asking questions. What's it going to be? When is it opening? Can we come inside to see it? The hostility that had defined the community's relationship with the factory was beginning to shift. Curiosity was replacing resentment. Interest was replacing opposition. The renovation took 11 months from start to finish. 11 months of construction, complaints, setbacks, discoveries, and determination. But when it was done, when the last contractor packed up and left, what remained was extraordinary. The factory had been completely transformed. It was unrecognizable from the damaged ruin I'd purchased. It was beautiful. It was functional. It was exactly what I'd envisioned from the beginning. The grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday morning in spring. I'd advertised locally. I'd reached out to vendors and event planners. I'd connected with local food businesses. I'd built anticipation in the community. The market vendors had been selected through an application process. Local artisans, food producers, small business owners who needed affordable retail space. The event calendar was already filling up before we even opened. The morning of the opening, people started arriving early. Way earlier than I'd expected. There was a line forming before we even unlocked the doors. Families, couples, young professionals, people who'd heard about the transformation and wanted to see it for themselves. People who'd driven past the factory for years and were curious about what it had become. When we opened the doors, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People walked in and stopped. They looked up at the steel beams. They looked at the exposed brick walls. They looked at the restored hardwood floors. They looked at the natural light streaming through the skylights. They took pictures. They sent messages to friends telling them to come. Social media posts started appearing within the first hour. The market vendors were busy from the moment the doors opened. People browsed the artisan stalls. They sampled food from the food hall vendors. They sat at tables and had conversations. They spent money. Real money. The kind of foot traffic and sales volume that vendors dream about on opening day. Several vendors told me they'd sold more in the first 4 hours than they typically sold in a full weekend at other markets. The event space bookings accelerated after the opening. People who came to the market walked through and saw the event space. They immediately started asking about availability. Wedding planners called. Corporate event coordinators reached out. Photography studios inquired about hourly rentals. The industrial aesthetic that the HOA had called an eyesore was exactly what event planners were looking for. Revenue started flowing immediately. Vendor rental fees came in monthly. Event bookings generated significant per-event income. The food hall created daily cash flow. Within the first 3 months of operation, the business was generating enough revenue to cover all operating expenses and begin servicing the renovation loan. Within the first year, the factory was profitable. Not just breaking even. Actually profitable. Generating returns that exceeded my initial projections. The combination of 3 revenue streams working together created the financial resilience I'd planned for. When vendor income was slower in certain months, event bookings picked up the slack. The model worked exactly as I designed it. The HOA's reaction to the success was fascinating to watch. The president who had handed me that demolition letter, who had laughed at my plans, who had spent 11 months filing complaints against my construction project, went very quiet. There were no more letters. There were no more complaints. There were no more appearances at city meetings to oppose my project. Because she couldn't argue with success. She couldn't argue with a building full of people spending money. She couldn't argue with vendors earning income and building businesses. She couldn't argue with an eyesore transformed into a community asset. The result spoke louder than any letter she could write. The months following the opening brought changes I hadn't fully anticipated. The factory became a destination. People from neighboring cities started visiting. Food bloggers wrote reviews. Local media outlets ran features. A regional magazine included the factory on a list of must-visit places. The attention drove even more traffic. The business grew beyond my initial projections. Employment was another significant outcome. The market vendors employed people. The food hall restaurants hired staff. I'd hired property managers and maintenance staff. In total, the factory created over 40 jobs. Jobs that hadn't existed when the building sat abandoned. Jobs that brought income to people in the community. Jobs that contributed to the local economy. The property value discussion became particularly interesting. The HOA had spent years claiming the abandoned factory was destroying property values in their community. But data from real estate sales in the year after the factory opened told a different story. Home values in the surrounding HOA community actually increased. The factory had become an amenity. Homes near the factory could now market themselves as being close to a popular shopping and dining destination. What had been a liability became an asset. Some of the same HOA residents who'd complained most loudly about the factory now shopped at the market regularly. I'd see them browsing vendor stalls on weekends. I'd see them having lunch in the food hall. I'd see them bringing out-of-town guests to show off the transformed space. They didn't apologize for their previous opposition. They just quietly became customers and started enjoying what the factory had become. The HOA president eventually reached out to me about something completely different. She asked if the event space might be available for an HOA community gathering. She was professional. She was respectful. She acted as if the previous year of conflict had never happened. I quoted her the standard event rental rate. She booked it. The HOA held their annual meeting in the factory they demanded I demolish. The irony was not lost on me. Over time, the relationship normalized. The HOA stopped seeing me as an adversary. I stopped seeing them as an obstacle. We became what we should have been from the beginning, neighbors with different properties coexisting in the same area. They managed their residential community. I managed my commercial property. We stayed out of each other's way. The business continued to grow. I expanded the vendor spaces. I added more food hall stalls to meet demand. I upgraded the event space with better lighting and sound systems. I invested profits back into the property to make it even better. The factory that everyone had wanted demolished became the most successful commercial property I'd ever owned. Other opportunities emerged from the success. Developers started approaching me about consulting on similar adaptive reuse projects. I was asked to speak at real estate investment conferences about transforming abandoned industrial properties. The factory became a case study. A proof of concept. A demonstration that condemned buildings don't always need to be demolished. Sometimes they need vision and investment and persistence. Looking back, I realize the HOA's opposition actually helped me in unexpected ways. Their constant complaints forced me to document everything meticulously. Their objections made me refine my plans more carefully. Their resistance made me more determined to succeed. If they'd simply left me alone, I might have cut some corners. I might have done a less thorough job. But their pressure forced me to do everything perfectly. To leave no legitimate grounds for complaint. To build something undeniably successful. The abandoned factory that everyone wanted gone became the profitable business that proved them all wrong. So what can you take away from this story? What are the real lessons here that apply beyond just one factory and one HOA? Because there are principles in this experience that can help anyone dealing with opposition, anyone looking at unconventional investments, anyone facing pressure to abandon their vision. The first lesson is about seeing potential where others see problems. Everyone looked at that abandoned factory and saw an eyesore that needed to be demolished. I looked at the same building and saw opportunity. The difference wasn't in the building itself. The difference was in perspective. Most people look at current condition and assume that's all there is. But valuable opportunities exist in the gap between current condition and future potential. Train yourself to see that gap. Train yourself to imagine what something could become, not just what it is right now. The second lesson is about understanding your actual rights versus what others claim you can't do. The HOA insisted I had to demolish the building. They made it sound like I had no choice. They made it sound like their demands were legally enforceable. But when I consulted with a lawyer, when I researched property law, I discovered I had far more rights than they wanted me to believe. People in positions of authority often overstate their power. They count on you not knowing your actual rights. Don't take their word for it. Research. Consult professionals. Understand what you can legally do before you accept what someone tells you that you can't do. The third lesson is about persistence in the face of organized opposition. The HOA didn't just complain once. They mounted a systematic campaign to stop me. Letters. Complaints. City meetings. Code enforcement. They threw every obstacle they could think of at my project. A less determined person would have given up. Would have decided the fight wasn't worth it. Would have sold the property at a loss and walked away. But I kept going. I addressed every complaint. I obtained every permit. I solved every problem. Persistence beats resistance when you're legally in the right and committed to your vision. The fourth lesson is about the value of adaptive reuse. Demolition is often the default assumption for damaged or abandoned buildings. Tear it down and start over. But demolition destroys value. It destroys the embodied energy in existing structures. It destroys architectural character that can't be replicated. It destroys potential. Adaptive reuse preserves what's valuable while transforming what isn't working. It's often more sustainable and more profitable than demolition and new construction. Before you tear something down, seriously consider whether transformation is possible. The fifth lesson is about letting results speak for themselves. I could have spent enormous energy arguing with the HOA, defending my vision, trying to convince them my plan would work. But words weren't going to change their minds. Only results would. So I focused my energy on building rather than arguing. I focused on execution rather than persuasion. And when the factory opened successfully, when it became profitable, when it started benefiting the community, all the arguments became irrelevant. Results are the most powerful response to criticism. The sixth lesson is about financial courage backed by solid research. Buying that factory was risky. The renovation was expensive. There was real possibility of failure. But the risk was calculated, not reckless. I'd researched the market. I'd studied similar projects. I'd developed financial projections. I'd secured adequate financing. I'd planned for contingencies. Financial courage doesn't mean gambling blindly. It means taking calculated risks based on solid analysis. Do your homework. Understand the numbers. Plan thoroughly. Then have the courage to act. The seventh lesson is about community benefit creating acceptance. The HOA opposed me because they saw my project as harmful to their interests. But when the factory became successful, when it created jobs, when it increased property values, when it became an amenity rather than a liability, opposition faded. People accept what benefits them even if they initially opposed it. If your project creates genuine value for the community, resistance will eventually give way to acceptance. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever bought a property everyone else thought was hopeless? Have you ever faced opposition from an HOA or community group? Have you ever transformed something abandoned into something profitable? Share your stories in the comments. I love hearing about unconventional investments and people who refuse to give up on their vision. If this story inspired you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about property investment, dealing with HOAs, and turning opposition into opportunity. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. And remember this. Other people's lack of vision doesn't have to limit your possibilities. Other people's opposition doesn't have to stop your progress. Other people's assumptions about what's possible don't have to become your reality. That abandoned factory taught me that condemned doesn't mean worthless. Opposition doesn't mean impossible. And everyone saying no doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it just means you're seeing something they can't see yet. Trust your vision. Do your research. Know your rights. And build something that makes all the doubters irrelevant.